Graham Potter is the new West Ham coach, and whilst he comes with lots of tactical tweaks and lots of new ways of playing the game, there are some common factors that we can assess to realise how he's going to get on at West Ham, what we've seen so far, what we've seen from his teams in the past, and how it can translate into his West Ham side. A key principle to take into account when Potter formulates his templates for his team is it's about how we best utilise the available players that we have. And this is an example that we saw straight away with his first West Ham team against Aston Villa. This was the team that Graham Potter put out in his last game in charge of Brighton, playing that 3-5-2, again, looking with Gross in that sort of key role with a little bit more freedom. He had two strikers, Welbeck being a little bit more of a target man in this sense, and then he had those high-flying wing-backs with March and Trossard. Move on to his last Chelsea lineup, it looked a little bit more like this, with again a bit of a 3-4-3 or a 3-4-2-1, having the likes of Havertz, Felix and Mudryk, more so Havertz and Felix, who could interchange and that little bit more movement in the attacking thirds, again with a wing-back system. And now, whilst we've seen him start in a 4-2-3-1 with his first West Ham team, Paqueta, Kudus and Somerville, and the way that they were sort of played in this game and composed within this game is a really important thing to look at. The usage of Somerville as a winger, but also dropping in to make that temporary back five, allowed the team to mould between the two shapes, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more on the tactics board. Kudus in that central area allowed him to latch onto second balls, use that pace and power, not only in transition, but also picking up second balls and getting those shots off on goal. And Paqueta, again, a bit of a hybrid role, allowed him to arrive in more space. This image here highlights that, showing the two wing-backs in this supposed system, with Somerville slightly higher up because he's the more natural winger, whereas Scholes is a bit deeper as that fullback that is becoming the winger to provide width. Then you can see Paqueta much closer infield to the likes of Füllkrug and Kudus, ready to play off of him. So it's probably at this point in the video where West Ham fans have realised that I'm a Chelsea fan and they're probably more inclined to switch off. But I do urge you to stay as I sort of walk through the process and the tactics in the framework of what Potter actually looked to execute, not only last night, but how it could sort of frame as the season goes on and how that could change. So as you can see on paper here, we've got this sort of 4-2-3-1, relatively sort of simple in that sense. Paqueta on the left, Kudus in the 10, Somerville on the right. And that will be very different to what West Ham have sort of seen this season and even last season, right? With Kudus was more often on the right, but he did play in the 10 a bit. Paqueta has played off the left before. Somerville more of a left winger than a right winger. But it's the roles of which all three of these guys play. And it takes us back to that quote that we spoke about earlier, in the fact that Graham Potter wants his side and he wants to elevate the best players in his side and get the best out of them. So if he can put his attacking players in the best zones for them to succeed with their skill set, then he is succeeding in putting a tactical framework together that works for his side. How this team essentially shifted, let's start with on the ball, was Scales would often look to sort of provide this little bit of width. Now, when starting out from the back in the really deep sets of possession, you'd have the centre-backs to begin with. They'd split in this manner. And then Kilman could then drag into here. Fabianski could sort of take up the ball in these areas here. Mavropanos was here, Wan-Bissaka here. So when Scales moves up, you then actually have this sort of this temporary back four across the back in that deep phase, that first phase of build-up. You then also have this double pivot. Probably not the best for progression in terms of their ability on the ball, but protection-wise, you've got quite a bit of height there. Souček adds a little bit more mobility in that pivot than, say, Alvarez and Guido Rodriguez, who's slightly better at progressing the ball, but you add a little bit more physicality in this sense if the ball is turned over. So you do have that sort of protection layer in Souček. And the idea here is essentially to miss the pivot. They're there to drag players forward with them, okay? Because with what Potter wants to do here is by sending Scales forward. I've put Scales, it's Skulls. My bad. Putting Skulls forward, it allows Paqueta to drift inside, which then creates this really deadly triangle, which we're going to form here, okay? Now, Füllkrug did go off early, but we see this instantly from the start in terms of this shape that I've set out here, where it's essentially you've got the fullback, but you've actually got one of being the goalkeeper. So you've got these sort of wide outlet balls ready, who can drift inside and make those runs. But when that ball goes direct, say from Kilman, I think it is on the first occasion that we've got an example from, into Füllkrug, Paqueta is coming inside at that point. Kudus is playing in that number 10, which again, I think is going to get the best out of him because he's playing close to a striker where these drop down balls are going to be in and around here. Okay. And as that ball drops, it allows players like Kudus and Paqueta to latch onto them as these second balls facing forward with momentum. And that's going to get the best, especially out of Kudus, who's quick in eating up space, getting in, winning the ground duel. And then when he picks up the ball here, he can then quickly shift onto his strong left foot, get a shot off, or he can beat his man, put a ball across the box. And it's these sort of sharp, instinctive movements I think is going to get the absolute best out of Kudus in terms of working off of a target man. Now, Füllkrug did go off, which is an issue, because Danny Ings, we're just going to have to do this. Danny Ings did come on up front, okay? And that's less of an outlet, okay? And we saw that straight away. But he still was almost looking to make those little movements, those little counter movements where he takes a man away so that Kudus can actually be the one that attacks the space. And again, I think that's really, really important. And having the likes of Somerville and even Paqueta at times was dropping into this sort of space here to help progress play. But Somerville was what he was doing really well is if Wan-Bissaka sort of drifted in a little bit just to take the angle, Somerville could come in, receive this ball here, and then he was a really good carrying outlet up the field. And it gets the best out of him because he gets what he did so well for Leeds is he'd pick the ball up in sort of these deep left sort of areas, and he would just be able to carry Leeds out from the back with that progressive carrying quality. And it gets the best out of Somerville in that sense. He's facing forwards, he can beat his man, he can help West Ham to progress the ball up the pitch. And then when he does get to here, he has the creative passing to, if he can draw two men towards him like this, then he'll happily try and find that little gap there with a pass or even by carrying it. So let's get rid of all these lines. And now we're going to talk about the idea out of possession, right? Because again, Potter has been known to sort of switch these roles up in terms of what he does out of possession. And you could, as we said earlier, call this that 4-2-3-1. But Potter has played 5 at the back and 4 at the back in his time. And I think a lot of the reasoning to having Somerville here was because this is essentially a back 5 at possession that could then extend into that front 5 with Skulls pushing forward to become that sort of left wing back. So off the ball, you often saw Kilman shift over, Mavropanos become that central centre back, Wan-Bissaka would tuck into here, Somerville would become that right wing back, and then here you would essentially then have Paqueta sort of filling in this gap, Kudus sort of filling in this gap, and Ings here. So you sort of had a similar-ish shape to Manchester United's Amorim team, with that sort of 3 here, or even Palace, with that 2 pivot, the 3 up the front, sort of ready to cut off these half-space angles here. And then Ings there. If Kudus did press out, which happened more often on that side than Paqueta's side, to become sort of that front 2, then Paqueta would almost tuck in and you would sort of see them become a 3 in midfield. But that could also cause Somerville to jump out or even Wan-Bissaka, which did sometimes leave a bit of space over on this side. But I think in time that will be worked on. So I don't think that's too big of an issue for the time being.
An example of this was the Aston Villa goal, where both Kufal and Wan-Bissaka sort of advanced into this area when Wan-Bissaka maybe should have dropped off to cover the space behind Kufal so they weren't both aggressing.
But that is the premise of the shape that we saw. And I do think that imagine this in Bowen, for example. That's another role I think will suit him really well. Picking up the ball, driving it towards the byline and using that sort of outlet running power to get forward. He also will work hard and get back into these areas to help out. But then as well, he can attack the box from deep. And I do think it could sort of open up those little spaces for him to, again, score goals. But he could also play as the more attacking of the 3 if Paqueta wasn't playing, for example. Somerville plays on the left and it shifts the dynamic. So there's different ways of doing it, for sure. But Bowen is another big one that could come into the team. Orford is another one that I think could really thrive in one of these roles to add a little bit of mobility, but add the mobility whilst bringing in that little bit of extra progressive passing, because what you'll often see is with those fullbacks high up, or the winger and the fullback, and in this sort of like 3-2-5 shade that you've come to sort of know, That for me does lack a little bit of progression. I think your best bet is with Kilman on the ball and being a bit more sort of direct with his passing. But I do think that they could do with not only the mobility that we've mentioned all season with West Ham in midfield, but a mixture of the mobility with the progressive passing and that sort of eye to open up those and progress the ball through. It doesn't matter if you're missing out that pivot, it's not as important, like we said earlier, with those long balls into, say, Fulkrug. But you want to be able to mix it up and like, sort of enter your pivot to go through out to the two pocket players, or to play through straight to the striker through one of your pivot players, or to use those sort of combinations to open up spaces into here. So that's something I would sort of take into account with Lewis Orford. I think that's an option that they could go for sure. Tadiba, I think, would work really well in this back line as well. Areola could come in. Soler, we saw as well. I think he adds that same thing that we're talking about, that little bit of extra deep progression. And of course, I'm expecting Emerson to sort of take this role as well and get that little bit more attacking out of him, because I do like him in that role. He did that a lot for Chelsea as well, in that sort of attacking left wing back role. So I think that will suit him too. And then Fulkrug, if he doesn't come back, over here we just put a few sort of transfer ideas. Ferguson, I think that would make a lot of sense. I had that written down even before the injury to Fulkrug, but I think, like we say, with that sort of direct approach to then bring these two into play, I think bringing Ferguson back to work with Potter to get a loan for him where he's going to get good minutes, I think would make a lot of sense. So, and they're already linked with that. So that for me would be a really, really good move alongside Fulkrug to then help him get back to fitness, because he's the type of striker that you need for this type of play. Carney Chukwuemeka, another one. I think with Kudus being that sort of one who drops into these areas and drives out, he'd probably suit that number 10 role as well. But he could also play in that midfield too, as the more progressive, maybe in that Souček role. Again, brings a little bit more progression, can bring the ball out with his carrying, adds the athleticism that you need. Not quite, I think you could still do with a different profile in there, but that's why I sort of highlighted Orford as well. If you have any other transfer sort of recommendations, do let me know. Might get around to making a little transfer video for West Ham and who I think they should target. Maybe touch on these two, and then I'll do a little bit more research into which centre mid profiles I think they should target. But I don't think it's going to be too much done this window, which is why, again, the likes of Orford and Scarles could be really important to adding profiles that they need and a little bit extra from the sort of youth and bring them through the academy, which hopefully Potter will sort of utilize. If you've enjoyed this video, if you've got any questions, do let me know. If you've enjoyed, if you want more videos like this, if you want to check out some of my other content, go do so. Drop a like on the video, subscribe to me if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys in the next one.